This is Joe with US Sander, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how to rebuild a B2 edger. What we do in a typical rebuild is we replace the bearings, we check the pad, replace the brushes, and also check the switch. Before you take it apart, you want to make sure that the edger is running. So first tip it on its back, remove your cover. You don't want to leave it sitting on the pad when you plug it in case your switch is bad, because then it'll take off and jump off your bench. What we're going to do is we're going to check and make sure this runs and check our brushes, see how they're running, if there's excessive arcing. Make sure you wear proper hearing protection. In this case, the edger seems to be running pretty good, except the brushes are worn down. You can see the wear mark here. That is the limit to how far down these brushes go, so they are right at the limit. So they definitely need replaced. If you are getting excessive arcing, that can be caused by any number of things, from a bad armature to a bad bearing in the top, or just your brushes are all the way down and they're not lined up with each other properly. Before we take this apart, we want to check and make sure that our bearing is tight by pushing this armature in either direction. If you can feel or see any movement, that means that your top housing is worn or your bearing is excessively worn. In that case, you're going to need to check it once you pull this apart with a new bearing. See how that new bearing fits in the top housing. If it is loose, then this will need to be repaired. We want to take apart the bottom end first because there is grease here, and once you take your top end apart, it's difficult to hold this edger upside down, and so you will end up getting grease all over the place because you can't keep the edger upright to keep the grease in place. If you have one of these edger pad removal tools, that's going to be the best method of removing this pad. It fits in your holes. This is regular thread, so you're going to turn it counterclockwise. Use something in your fan to jam it to prevent it from turning. Usually I find it works best to brace the edger on the bench in a manner that it will not roll. And then you can get some extra leverage breaking that pad loose. If you do not have a pad removal tool, then the recommended method is using something in the hole. You can put a punch in the hole in the pad and whack it with a hammer to break it loose. If you do use this method, do not stick anything in the fan because the impact can break the fan. With your pad off, there are 3 screws underneath that hold this retainer on. Now we can remove the retainer and our roller guard. It's always a good idea to check your fit of your roller guard. If there's an excessive play, and that's something that concerns you, it will make a difference as far as hitting your baseboard. So this one does not have much play, so we're not going to replace it. But if it's excessively worn, a lot of times both the roller guard and this bottom plate will need to be replaced to eliminate that excessive play. It's not required for functioning of the edger, but it will cause your sandpaper to stick out further beyond that guard and cut into your baseboard more. We also want to check the threads inside our shaft, because while we've got this apart, it's a good time to change that shaft if they are excessively worn. To check this shaft, you want to take a new bolt. This is a 5/16 bolt, 1 inch long. Thread that in. See if you've got a lot of side-to-side slop. This is about typical on an edger. You want to make sure that your threads are biting good and it won't strip out that bolt prematurely. This one threads into about a 1/4 inch from the shaft. In some cases, what we see is the abrasive from sandpaper will build up inside this hole and you won't be able to thread in your bolt. In that case, you want to use a 1/4 inch drill bit to drill out that built up abrasive and dust, and then run a 5/16 tap in there to clean out those threads. Before we take this bottom plate off, we're going to clean the dust out of here. We don't want that getting inside the gearbox. It'll just make it more difficult to clean out when we go to replace the grease. Now we can remove the 3 screws that hold this bottom plate on. Typically on these screws will be nylon washers. Make sure you don't lose those washers. Sometimes they remain stuck in the plate. Sometimes they are stuck to the screws. This bottom plate is stuck in the edger fairly firmly. So my recommended method to remove it is using this little slide hammer. It'll thread into your shaft and you can use it to pop the bottom plate off. If you don't have access to one of those slide hammers, an alternative method is to use your pad wrench. It's got a 5/16 slot in it, so you can put the pad wrench across here and stick a bolt in and use that to draw this shaft out. Now we want to clean this grease out of here best we can before we flip this edger over and remove the top. Even with most of your grease removed, you could still have some loose grease and oil that will fall out, so you might want to put down some paper towels before you flip this back over to catch any of that. We have 4 screws on here that hold this top housing together. To get at these screws, you'll either need a right angle screwdriver or you'll need to remove the 2 handles. I usually use a right angle screwdriver to save the time of removing those handles. With the 4 screws removed, this top cover will come out, but it typically is a little bit tight because of this top bearing. So usually you want to take a pry bar and very lightly pry up on it until you can get underneath and pull that top cover off. Underneath there is usually 2 plates. On these newer edgers have this made as 1 plate that is trapped between the 2 fans permanently. If you have an older one, you'll need to make sure to remove those plates. We don't want those to get bent or damaged. Now this is just a press fit in the bottom, so we just need to use a soft punch to drive this out. You want to put your punch on the gear and just gently tap it out. Before we go any further, we're going to clean all the grease up with a parts cleaning solvent so that we have clean parts ready to be put back together once we change those bearings. Now that we have our parts cleaned up, we can go ahead and change the bearings. We've got a clip ring on the end of this shaft that will need to be removed, as well as one that holds this small gear in place. With those clip rings removed, we can remove these bearings as well. Typically, what I find works best is if you have a press, you can get some plates that go underneath the bearing and remove the bearing and gear all in one shot. under the bearing there is also a seal. You're going to want to replace that as well. The bearing on the other end is a little trickier to get off. If you have one of these bearing splitters, that's going to be your best bet, is clamping that between your bearing and the top of your armature and then using the press to press it off. If you don't have access to one of those, you can typically use a small pry bar. Be very careful when you're using this method because you don't want to damage the top of this armature. If that bearing comes off too easily, you may have a worn armature here, so you'll have to check when you put the new bearing on, make sure it is a light press fit and there is no play in it. If you had any hop in your brushes, you will need to get this to a motor shop to be turned back to round. But since this one was running true, we don't need to worry about that. On this bottom plate bearings, they are a fairly tight press fit, so we do not want to pry against this at all. It will bend. Your best bet is to either use plates like we did for the small gear, or use one of these bearing pullers if you have that instead. If you're using a bearing puller, you want to be very careful that you don't damage the teeth on this gear. You want to pull the gear and bearing together. With that removed, there is a large clip ring that holds this bearing and seal in this housing. You're going to need to remove that. With that clip ring removed, we can press the shaft, bearings, and seal out. Be sure that you're supporting the plate on these clips here with enough clearance for the bearing to fit through. If your shaft came out with the bearings on it, then you will need to support the bearing and press the shaft out of it. On this plate there is a gasket. You can see in this case the gasket is torn, so we want to replace it. Typically your grease will still leak past the gasket if it is bad. You may need a sharp knife to scrape that gasket off. Once you have that scraped off, you want to take and put a little drop of super glue in 4 places. That'll help hold the new gasket in place while you install it. Now we take a 6203 bearing and we press that into this plate. Be sure you don't press on the seal surface, that will damage the seal. Before you put the seal in, you want to press the shaft in, because on your new seal, you want the spring facing up, and if you try to press the shaft in this way, it will often curl this lip on the seal in and damage it. So it's better to press the shaft in and then press this down over top of the shaft the other direction. this seal against this outer lip. Be careful that whatever you're using to press it in does not press on the rubber. That'll damage it. With that in place, we can put the clip ring back in. Now this gear can go back on. If you look closely at your gear, the hub sticks out more on one side than the other. The hub that is sticking out more needs to face up. So in this case, the taller hub is here, and we press it down onto our shaft. Next, we take the 87502 bearing. These are a little bit special of a bearing. If you look closely, the hub sticks out more on one side than the other. One side's flush, the other side has that center race sticking out. That taller center race has to go down towards the gear. Now we can reinstall the clip ring. Now on our armature, because there is a seal that goes on here, we can't put the bearing and gear together on this. They have to be pressed into the housing and then this put in afterwards. So we just want to put the top 6201 bearing on it. And then we will install it in the lower housing. Because this housing is not flat, it's actually angled, we don't want to install this bearing in the press because that will cause it to go crooked. Hang your wheels over the edge of the bench because we don't want any weight put on those. Then we set our 6203 bearing in the top here. It may drop in, or you may need to use a driver to drive it in. Next, take your seal. You want to put the spring side down. Gently tap your seal in until it bottoms out. Before we put this armature in those bearings, we want to inspect the keyway. In this case, the old key was worn, so we're replacing it. This new key is slightly loose in this shaft. We can put it in by hand instead of needing to press it. So what we're going to do is we're going to stake it just a little bit to make sure it doesn't come out when we try to put the gear on. You want to take a small prick punch and just very gently, right next to that key on either side. That'll hold that key in place while we put it together. We can now gently tap this in place. Don't use a hard-faced hammer because we don't want to damage that top bearing. Once that's in, we can put our gear on the bottom side. You're going to have to kind of balance this on the top. We don't want to put the top cover on yet because with that top housing, then that will be bearing the load as we drive this on. Your gear has one small portion that is turned down smaller. That has to go towards the bearing. Make sure your key is lined up. If you have a new key and it's not properly seated, You may not be able to get it started without seating that slightly at an angle towards your gear. Now watch your key as you drive that on gently. You don't want that key to come back out. Once the gear's in place, we can put that clip ring back on. I recommend replacing that clip ring as it has a tendency to stretch out because it's so small. And we flip our edger back over. Again, we want the wheels to be hanging off the bench so they're not bearing any load. Be sure to clean this surface so that your top housing will seat correctly. Reinstall these plates the same way they were. We don't want to flip them because that can cause them to rub against the fans. In some cases, you may want to put a little piece of tape on either side to hold them in place. If your top housing is a tight fit, if you're driving on that, these have a tendency to move. Before we put the top housing on, we are going to put new brushes in this because that reduces the likelihood that we'll drop a brush inside the edger. If you have the new style brushes, you'll need to remove the entire brush housing, in which case you don't want to reinstall those brush holders until after you've put it on the armature. The long edge of your brush faces out away from the brush holder, like so. You just want to lightly snug that brush in place. We may have to adjust it once we get it in place. Now with one hand on each brush, you want to pull those brushes back and set your top housing over top. With that seated, we can put the screws back in. If you're replacing the light bulb, now is the time to do it because your front light cover can make it difficult to access it. With those screws tightened down, you want to make sure your armature turns over freely. Before we plug this in, we're going to go ahead and change that switch. When you're replacing the switch, you want to make sure you get your wiring correct. In this case, this one is actually wired backwards from how it should be. We have this black wire goes down to the high-low switch. It should be opposite the black wire coming in. Instead, it's opposite the white wire. So we're going to go ahead and switch those when we put the new switch in. On your new switch, the notch is off position. So push your lever towards that back notch. You want your switch to be in this way so that forward is on and back is off. If you're like most people, you're going to want your light to be on all the time. If instead you want your light to only be on when the edger is on, you're going to want to connect your small light wires on the same end of the switch as your wires going into the motor. Okay, we've connected our power in white wire to this side of the switch. we want to find the wire that goes up, which is this one. This one goes down. The wire that goes up gets connected directly opposite that white wire. And the wire that goes down gets connected directly opposite the black wire. You want to wrap your switch with electrical tape to cover those exposed terminals. Your new switch should have 2 nuts on it. What usually works the best is having the hex nut on top so you can tighten the switch up, and put the knurled nut below. Now we want to make sure that our jumper wires from the high-low switch also fit inside this box. So we carefully put this back together. Make sure you don't get any pinched wires underneath. At this stage, we have the top end put back together, but the bottom end is still apart. We want to run it at this point and make sure we don't have any problems, because we need the bottom apart in order to take that armature back out. So if anything goes wrong, we want to find out now, not after the bottom's together. Make sure that your brushes are lined up with your armature correctly. We don't want them to be touching flush the entire width of the brush, not touching more on the top or bottom. Once they're adjusted so that they contact evenly, snug up those screws. You don't want to over tighten it and break this carbon. Now we're going to plug it in and make sure that it runs correctly. When we do that, we want to seat these brushes. We use this brush stone to seat the brushes. What we're going to do is very lightly run it across the face of that armature as it's running. That'll leave a small deposit of this very fine abrasive, which will wear those brushes slightly until they match the shape of the armature. You could see as we did that, we went from a heavy arcing because of a very small contact on that brush to a faint blue line as the brush seated and was contacting the armature the way it was supposed to. If you have a set of brushes that don't seat after a few seconds with that, typically after about 30 seconds of running with that stone against the armature, it will seat the brushes. If it does not, then your armature probably has a problem, whether it be just a hop, which you'll be able to see as it slows down, your brush moving in and out, or you may have a bad winding in the armature, which will cause the same problem. The only other possibility in a case like this is if your brushes are not perfectly lined up with each other. You can check that by setting your brush lined up with one of the notches and check and make sure that the other one is also lined up with in the same position. If they are not, then you'll need to bend that brush holder to adjust it. We cover that in the video on installing the old style brush holders. You don't have to worry about that if you have new style brush holders, because the fixed brush holder always stays lined up. Before we put the bottom end together, we're going to put the top cover on. Makes it easier to balance this when it's upside down. You want to put grease inside this housing. and around this gear. The new grease comes in these squeeze bottles. The hole in the lid tends to be a little small, so you may want to cut it open larger. Begin by generously squeezing your grease over this gear. We also want to squirt some around this gear. You're going to use pretty much your entire bottle of grease. Put it in these wells on either side. If you have an older edger, you won't have as big of a well, so you don't want to use the entire bottle of grease in here. Typically, you can tell the difference by, instead of this being a recess here, it's this size all the way around. In that case, make sure you use only about half the bottle of grease. Be sure you don't have any pieces of gasket stuck to this housing. And you've got a continuous gasket on this housing. And we flip this over. Make sure your gears line up, and you just want to very gently work it in. Do not use the screws to draw this in. It will bend and break this plate. Take your screws, make sure you have your nylon washer on there. Use the screws to keep it lined up. And you can use a soft face hammer to gently tap it in until it's properly seated. With it seated, you can now snug up these screws. Next, we want to make sure this still turns over freely. You can use a screwdriver in the fan just to turn it over. And put your roller guard in place and the retainer with the 3 screws. On the older steel edger pads, there were fiber washers between the bearing and the pad. For the newer aluminum pads, those are no longer required. Some people do still like to put one washer on because it makes it easier to remove the pad when you go to change it. But you don't want to reuse any of those old fiber washers because they will not seat the same and they will cause your pad to go crooked. So always put a new washer if you're going to put one in. I typically do not put them in. Thread your pad on until snug and make sure you tighten it with a wrench. Sometimes the pads will thread on and stop, but they're not fully seated, so it's always important to tighten it with a wrench. Before we start the edger, we always want to put a paper bolt and washer in place, because otherwise, as the edger is slowing down, the pad may unthread itself. Whenever you've had the pad off of an edger, you always need to dress it when you reinstall it. In this case, we're going to check our adjustment before we do that. Usually the best method of checking it is checking by looking underneath with the edger on a flat surface. You'll be able to see roughly in what position the edger is contacting this way. Then we turn it sideways and look underneath this way and see how far back it's contacting. In this case, by looking underneath, I can see that the edger is contacting in roughly this position back to about here, which is what we normally shoot for on a B2. If you're putting a new pad on and your edger is quite a bit out of adjustment, a good starting point is putting a nickel and a dime under the back of the edger. You want it to be pretty level, so it usually works best if you have a nickel and a dime under this corner and this corner right in front of your wheels. That'll be a good starting point, but you'll usually have to adjust it some from there. If you need to adjust it, these screws adjust your wheels and these lock it in place. So you'll need a 1/2 inch wrench to loosen these, A 1/2 inch wrench will loosen these nuts as well, and you'll need a 5/32 Allen wrench to adjust the screw as needed. By tightening the screw, that will raise the back of the edger up so that you'll cut further on the nose. Loosening the screw will lower the back of the edger so that you'll cut further back. And adjusting one side instead of the other, as you tighten the screw on this side, it will tip the edger this way, which will make it cut more in this direction. So keep in mind, when you're adjusting side to side, you want to tighten the screw opposite where you're going, or loosen the screw next to where you want it to go. Again, we always want to tip it on its back before we plug it in. As we dress this pad, I'm using a 50 grit sandpaper here. You can use 50 or 60 grit. You want it to be adhesive back so it sticks down firmly, as flat a surface as possible. We don't want to put the whole weight of the edger on the pad. We're just very lightly dressing it. We're not trying to remove much rubber. We're just trying to blend it so that there's no hop. You don't want to sand the pad for any more than about 30 seconds. Otherwise, it will overheat and the rubber will get sticky. In this case, we seem to have pretty good contact. You can see it's a little uneven. It's contacting about 2 bars here and 3 bars here. If you have a lot, even more than that, like 2 to 3 bars difference, you're going to want to lower the back of the edger and dress the whole thing until it is flat, and then raise it back up to get the contact where you want.